Welcome to the exhibition Berlin at the Helmut Newton Foundation. My name is Matthias Harder. I'm the curator and director. We have for the first time a show just with Helmut Newton's Berlin pictures. We see him here first in the age of 16 with the 3 pictures. 2 of them were shot as self-portraits in Iva's studio, where he did an apprenticeship between 1936 and 1938 before he left the city, his hometown, for Trieste, Singapore, Melbourne, and so on. On one picture, we see him with a hat and a coat, as he would be Egon Erwin Kisch, the reporter he admired in these years. In between, Helmut Newton with his 3 girlfriends, the Hallensee swimming pool, and where he was trained nearly every day as a swimmer. And on the other picture, with a lab coat and a huge camera coming more or less directly out from the lab, he was working for Eva and developing her negatives and film. And then the last picture, Helmut Newton in a tweed suit in his teenager years. So then he left Berlin and he was trained with Eva, the legendary photographer Eva, whose work we will see in this group show as well on the other side. He didn't photograph his city so often. Actually, he started in 1932 with his first roll of film, the Funkturm, the radio tower. And this is more or less the kickstart. This would be the number 1 in his oeuvre catalogue of photography. As he was out of the city, he had still a job to do here in his hometown. So he came back just 21 years later. In the meantime, he opened a studio in Melbourne, a photo studio, a portrait studio, a fashion photo studio. So he came back before publishing a lot of pictures, in magazines like Australian Vogue and different other. And so he was commissioned by Constanze magazine to shoot some German fashion in front of some landmark buildings in Berlin. So we see here for the first time ever a series of 5 pictures on the wall with 3 models. They were changing the clothes from frame to frame, more or less. And 4 of these landmark buildings are very famous ones. The Brandenburg Gate, Congress Hall, which is called as a nickname here in Berlin, the Pregnant Oyster, the Reichstag, and the monument in Tempelhof for this air hub, in 1949, as Berlin was supported by the Americans. The Soviet troops made a blockade, as you all know. Plus the Hilton Hotel. These 5 pictures, and the Hilton Hotel was just erected. We all know Newton's love for great hotels, and then he used this as a backdrop motive. So these very early fashion pictures are still a little bit classic. Helmut was coming and working in Paris from 1961 onwards, but also by then he was coming back to Berlin, to his native town, with commissions, for example, on this series of Mata Hari by European Vogue. In this case, he was transferring a famous spy story, from the First World War into the contemporary time. It was the figure of Mata Hari, a legendary figure, more or less, and she is played here by Brigitte Schilling, a supermodel, a German supermodel by then. So she is also changing clothes from frame to frame, and we see a facsimile of the pages in Vogue Europe. These part of the show we took over from a former show we already showed at the Foundation in 2015. It's part of pages from the glosses. But he oversaw during the shooting that there was a little maquette for one of the first dead person, shot down by the GDR troops. And then there was a big rumors and some very critical articles in the magazines and the newspapers in Berlin commenting this shooting. Besides this shooting, also some others for Constanze magazine again. So we see these 2 pictures here. These 2 ladies shot from more or less the frog perspective. These pictures create a new style. So they are looking down to the photographer and down to us. It's a kind of an imperfection. In the background, again, the Hilton Hotel. So 2 years, 3 years later, he took these pictures in the same spot as he took these first pictures in Berlin, coming back to Berlin in 59, also with the backdrop of the Hilton Hotel. So these pictures on the opposite wall, these were coming directly from the magazines. We don't have any negatives, and so we did scans from pictures, published in the magazine. For the first time, we go that way just to show his early pictures. We see two women in the Hilton at the bar. And these pictures, these two night pictures, it's an interior scene. They were completely revolutionary for Berlin, for Germany, for fashion photography in Germany. No other photographer took something like this. So he was trained already a little bit in Paris. He loved the luxury interiors and these mysterious women. These pictures were completely new. Seeing them in a magazine, there is no comparison with any other photographer. It's not only these kind of reproductions we have here on the wall, also vintage prints. A long time again that he came back to Berlin because of newspapers following the shooting at the Berlin Wall. What we see here is a series of vintage prints from the time. He published a few of them just many, many years later. These are not commissioned for any other magazines. We see here a travesty cabaret shot in 1977. So again, 14 years later, he came back to Berlin. In the meantime, he was a superstar. He did his first books, his first exhibitions, traveling to the US and doing shootings here and there. But he came back again. And he was fascinated by these changing, by this crossplay, by this man in women's clothes, singing, dancing. This cabaret called Lützower Lampe was a hotspot for the Berliners and also for the bourgeois Berliners. That reminded Helmut probably as well to the 1920s, to the Weimar Republic. It was an ongoing idea of these kind of liberal life in Berlin. Without any commission, he did these pictures just for himself. These small vintage prints being exhibited for the first time and shown here on the wall within the exhibition Berlin, Berlin. But it was not only this series. He realized in 1977 at this trip to Berlin, a group of pictures he shot in the restaurant Exil. What we see here is also Jenny Kapitän from behind with a cast, naked in the back room of the Exil with a ceiling drawing of Otto Mühl. A year before, he met in Paris the model Jenny Kapitän. So later on, she became a fashion editor as well for magazines and so on and so on. And you work with her. She was working with him on productions. But here we see her naked in an old guest house. So it's more or less the idea coming back to Berlin, photographing the lost Berlin more or less. The Berlin he was knowing as he was a kid and a teenager and a young adult before he left Berlin. The restaurant Exil was legendary, and we see the exterior of it with the maître d'hôtel, the bar itself with, the beer bar. And this was a place where all the musicians and all the theater players, the actors were coming and were frequently guests like David Bowie, Iggy Pop, and all the other people from the cultural scene, more or less the boheme scene. One picture here in the center on the bar, you see in the middle of the picture, Michel Würtler, who later on founded or get into the restaurant Paris bar, where Helmut and June were always doing the dinners after our openings, and his opening at the new National Gallery in Berlin. There was no commission. He did this for himself. He convinced Jenny Kapitän and a friend to pose naked in front of his camera. And Newton realized a little series here, publishing these pictures many years later in different other magazines. The last picture here with a frog on the cross, realized by Martin Kippenberger, a piece of art with a lot of controversial comments on it, was exhibited at the Paris bar. And then Newton doubled this idea of the hanging Christ, hanging Christ as a frog with a woman staying on the table. So this is a very provocative picture, but it was, later on just published in the magazine. And then we have this very famous, this iconic picture of Jenny Capitaine with the cast, in the Pension Florian, which was before the Pension Kitty, with a lot of stories behind, and Newton was very interested in these kind of stories, also criminal stories, spy stories. And there is also a story about that Salon Kitty, and there's a film, there are several books on that. So Newton was told what this kind of background and history was about, and he was very interesting to take pictures because there was a former brothel going with a model, with Jenny Capitaine, to this place, and creating such an ambiguous picture he was realizing already in Paris, parallel to these pictures. On the opposite wall, we see 5 pictures, 4 on the wall, 1 on the side between the windows. It's the same model. It's a blonde model, I guess a friend of Jenny Capitaine. He just met in Berlin, and she poses as a fashion model, as a nude model, in front of the Berlin Wall, in an interior looking down to the street with a bakery in the background. It's the very first picture on the wall, classical Newton fashion pose, but it was not used as one. It was not commissioned by one. Also, these pictures were just published many, many years later in different occasions. So he decided to show these pictures in different contexts. Coming back to Berlin with Jenny Capitaine, realizing his story, and then another one. But it was just, without any commission. And then 2 years later, he came back to Berlin, and then he realized something very, very special. Within the next room, we see a very important series Newton took in 1979, commissioned by German Vogue, as this magazine came back onto the market. It was on the market. It was read by Eva and his mother. It was a legendary magazine, but then, it was cancelled, and then, it came back onto the market. And Newton was asked to realize something which was similar, let's say, to the time as he was growing up in Berlin. So he came back with 2 models. And there's another props, included into these pictures, a blonde one and brunette one, and then he realized something as he would come back to Berlin, or as he would have stayed in Berlin, because some of the pictures are so incredible timeless. We have no idea, actually, looking at these for the first time, these pictures were shot in 1979. But it could be much earlier. Looking at the hair and so on, it could be the 30s. And also these shops, they were just there. Newton himself was super astonished that these kind of style were just existing in the year 1979. He decided later, 5 years later, to produce these 2 big prints for his exhibition and for his book, World Without Man. So realized in 1984, 5 years after the shooting. And this is what happens very often in Newton's work. He did something on commission for a magazine or a client and so on. So what we have here, these are new prints. And then we have the vintage prints of the shooting on the wall here with a Passepartout. Also the blonde model in front of a lake. It might be the Grunewald Lake or the Hahnsee. And we have, again, coming from the exhibition pages from the glosses we were showing about 10 years earlier, there's these kind of facsimiles of the pages. It was 14 pages in the magazine. It's very much, a lot of material. And looking onto the contact sheets of these shootings, there were many more motives. But they decided together for this series of 14 pages with the 2 models, with 2 men, 2 props more or less. Later on, these pictures came into the book, World Without Man, so it was a kind of a motto for him. that there is sometimes these kind of intersexual relationship, but sometimes it's just about them, the women. And as we can see here, it was not only about the dresses, it was, the outer dresses, it was also about lingerie. On one photo, on one of the vintage prints we have here in the archive, there's the handwritten notice of Helmut Newton. One picture from this series, it was very similar to the age, to the years as I was a young boy, as we went to the lakes, off the clothes, and just go swimming. It was very similar. And then he had something in mind to realize here again. So it's a Grunewald Lake in 1979, shot here with a two men and one woman. This was a motive, which appears very often in his photography. It was a kind of a naughty situation or the naughty interpretation of the times, and again, two women within the Grunewald Lake in lingerie. It's a very unusual picture idea, within the 70s. And the title, Berlin, Berlin, we took over for the whole exhibition and for the whole group show, because this series was so important for Newton. We see here the other model, an American model he brought over from Paris in the Tiergarten area with these kind of monuments of Moltke and Bismarck. That's always reminding us to his youth, and this was actually the idea behind, that he was shooting on some places. He had more or less completely carte blanche to realize something like this, which he might knew from his youth. And the first picture here, the last one, we look at the first picture within the magazine was a double page spread of the Brandenburg Gate with a model in lingerie, really unusual. And we all know this very famous picture of at Rue Briot with a woman wearing a tuxedo or a tuxedo-like pantsuit created by Yves Saint Laurent. So this idea of the nude or the dress picture, within the street, within the cities, but as a night shot, appeared very often, in Helmut Newton's photography. And it's always very funny to combine and to compare the fashion shoots Newton took and the nude photography. If we look through to the lobby with the big nudes in the background, we see Henrietta number 3. It's a big nude number 3, the center part, in the upper lobby. And it's exactly the same position of the hands. Berlin was shot in 1979, and the big nude in the background in the lobby was shot 1980 in Paris. So actually everything has something to do with the other genre in Helmut Newton's photography. And once he said this famous quote, my nude pictures look very much like the fashion pictures. It's like the fashion models just without any clothes. In this sector, in this main room of the 3 rooms in front, then we see that these different aspects of photography, the printed one, the reprinted one in a book, and then taking out as an exhibition print. And then we see the original huge silver prints, which we have here 2 examples of. One is from 1979. It's the same motif as we see in the magazine, and the other one is like mirrored, but has a different aspect. So 8 years later, he went to the same place, exactly the same place, the Brandenburg Gate, with a different graffiti on the wall, because it's the wall, it's not a construction site. It's a wall, we look at, because the Brandenburg Gate was in the Soviet sector. The first picture we saw here in the exhibition is he was coming back from Melbourne and from Paris back to Berlin, shot in 1959. Also the Brandenburg Gate was standing there without the wall, because the wall was built in August 1961. So as the wall was up, after August 1961, and Newton came back to the city, and when he was photographing the wall with something or without something in front of. So it was sometimes just the wall. And here the wall is a little bit uneven. The whole picture is a little bit uneven. So you get an incredible tension of, and then we see the model from behind, the blonde model, facing the other model, but shot 8 years later. And it was not for a fashion magazine. It was shot for the Traveler, Condé Nast Traveler magazine. We don't have a fashion picture in front of us. We have a travel picture in front of us, which explains a little bit the city of Berlin in the year 87. And nobody knew by then that 2 years later, the wall was going down, it was falling. Yeah, maybe Newton was so visionary that he was taking the wall so uneven, like an idea that the wall might go away one day. Anyhow, and then we see sometimes just the wall, because he was so interested in just the graffitis. And then you see very small here on the graffiti, Nazis raus, which means Nazis get out of the city. And as we know, Helmut Newton, as a Jew, was kicked out by the Nazis, in 1938, after Crystal Night. It's a kind of a commentary that he was very interested in. And this vintage print, just of the wall, shot here from these kind of watchtowers, these wooden watchtowers, in the western part, looking to the east. It's a very important picture. By the way, it shows the area around the Potsdamer Platz, which looked completely different just 10 years later. But going back into, this was the year 1980 as he shot this picture. So he was coming back to Berlin frequently, not only in 77, not in 78 and 9 and 80 and so on. But as it was Newton came back on commission of the magazines again and again. So in this case, it was Traveler magazine and the German Vogue, and we see more of these vintage prints here with the Passepartout, with the matting, and there's the model sitting here on the stones, and the regular people in the back, and Moltke, the very famous person, military person in German history, as a stone figure, as a monument in the background. So you sometimes you see directly or indirectly that we are here in Berlin. And of course, the Brandenburg Gate is known by everybody, but here again, why? We can ask us, why is the Brandenburg Gate with this kind of full light? Why it's lit? Most of us would say, of course, because it's a landmark building, but there's also a second reason for, because directly after that war, we see here in the background of this fashion picture motif, there was the death strip, and the GDR government lit this area with these bright lights, therefore that the people won't escape. And so this is, it's an incredible background motive for Newton, which he was using several times that way, also as a commentary on, let's say, on liberalism, on freedom. It was his beloved hometown, which became this kind of a very special backdrop for his photography, especially, of course, for fashion photography. But as we saw already, this is sometimes it was just travel photography about the city itself. Here's another picture, shot as a part of a series, The Woman with a Snake, shot here around the corner at the zoo, at the Berlin Zoo, in the aquarium. And we see here, this is also a fashion-based picture, but not being published in this shooting for the German Vogue, but just later. Here again, Newton decided to use this picture as a part of his book, and the series was called Private Property. So there was a little tiny book realized in the year 1809, a set of pictures, realized in 84, a kind of a best of pictures. And it's interesting that he decided for this picture, which was not published in this magazine, just a kind of a side shot, declared it as one of his main motives, as one of his best of pictures from that time, from the 70s and 80s, as he was realizing the project Private Property as an exhibition, as a book. So, and this book is still on the market, which is very, very unusual for a photo book realized in 89. Then we have again the idea of the doubling of the motive as a vintage print, as a motive within the layout of the magazine. So it's always interwoven in a way that we have just speaking about how the pictures look like in a magazine and how they look like as vintage prints without any typography on, And we have photo museum, and we are visited by so many people, they have a lot of knowledge about photography, its prints, its reproductions, and the surfaces as silver prints, PE prints, inkjet prints, and later ones, and so on. So we offer for all these people, these different aspects. So what we have here in the room, we have 3 enormous sized silver prints. So this was the year 86, 87, as we realized something for Traveler magazine, for another magazine in Germany, an art magazine called Wolkenkratzer. It's like a skyscraper. Would be the translation. And the department in the exhibition shows us a lot of portraits. So on the right hand, we see Helmut as a self-portrait. It was a by-shoot of a fashion shooting. So his assistant took this picture, but, actually Helmut prepared everything. It was at the outskirts of Berlin in a field. So the woman is laying in the field. There we see Janosch Fricot, who was the curator of the Berlinische Gallery by then at the Martin-Gropius-Bau. And he was the first curator doing a huge show on Helmut Newton at the Berlinische Gallery, at the Martin-Gropius-Bau in the year 88. This picture was shot in the studio of Raphael Reinsberg in Berlin-Wedding. It's a great character portrait of this famous curator. On the side, again, a huge silver print. It's a variant of the cover motif for Condé Nast's Traveler magazine, which you realized in 1987, and the shot was from 86, so it's always a little bit earlier, of course, and these are just 2 women, probably a mother and a daughter, and Newton shot this in the very north of Berlin and part of West Berlin called Lübars in a beer garden. But it's very unusual and astonishing that he was creating such a huge silver print of this motif, which is actually a side motif in his work. And also these pictures are shown here in our exhibitions, and besides all the other exhibitions, of Newton's work for the first time ever. But it was not these people alone, the curators, regular people, and it was also film stars, musicians. The film scene was very important for Newton. He was a cineast. He was watching so many movies. And so we encounter here with John Malkovich. He was realizing a film by then, 95. So it's a great portrait. We have shown before in our show, Men, War and Peace. As you can see, some of the pictures we have here on the wall are shown for the first time. Others are, shown again, creating a kind of an overview about a topic like Berlin. It can appear again, such a print of John Malkovich. Then we have Hanna Schigula. He was photographed by Helmut Newton. She looks like a giant here in front of the wall. On the side, it's a color picture. This is more or less the first color picture here in the show. It's Wim Wenders. We see on the left side the Berlin Wall. It must have been shot in somewhere in Kreuzberg. Also from a kind of these wooden watchtowers, but looking down in this case. And then again on the side, it's David Bowie, realized as a shooting here at the Kempinski Hotel, where Newton stayed very often as well. This was from the year 83. So you see here some samples of his portraits, which he was creating in the 80s. And on this wall with the landscape, Newton, the model, and the outskirts, and this gray sky, and so on, which is kind of famous for Berlin. It's really interesting because, you're having this big print. If we go over to the next room, we go on with a very long wall of these kind of landscapes within the city, or we can call it cityscapes. And yeah, it's very interesting because this part of his work is really unknown. Of course, he created a show called Saxon Landscapes for his Zurich gallery, and so we took it over as also to the Helmut Newton Foundation as an inaugural exhibition in 2004. But it keeps a little bit unknown. this part of his work. But, you see so many aspects, you have a portrait, and then you have the landscape aspect and the self-portrait and so on. So we are entering the last room of the 3 rooms of Helmut Newton here in the exhibition Berlin. And what we see here is the Helmut Newton Illustrated. It's a magazine he was creating by his own. This is edition number 2 or volume number 2. It's Berlin guest houses with nude photography. And the whole issue was dedicated more or less to nude photography, or there were also some shoots from Paris, from Malibu, Los Angeles. Here, this is a body of work he created in Berlin with models. One man is included. It's interesting, with this kind of juxtaposition with the naked and dressed. Actually was created years ago for the French Vogue, Italian Vogue, but he realized something like this, and he was inspired by Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, Berliner Illustrated magazine, by then from the 20s and the early 30s, which he was reading as a kid, as a school, as a teenager, and this is the same typo, and then later on he created his own magazine. In total, there were 4 issues and 4 volumes, in irregular intervals, and so this was the year 87 as he came back. He was not knowing, that 2 years later the wall might fall. But then as it happened, he was commissioned by Zeit magazine, which is the supplement of one of the great German papers, a weekly paper. And then he was realizing his story, Mein Berlin, so in other words, My Berlin. So he was going with a model directly to the places, again, Lübars and the Halensee area, where the wall was literally open. They opened the wall some months before and realized as a cover story. So again, he came back on commission of a magazine, and then we see here also for the first time these kind of prints. Most of them are vintage prints from the time, for the Helmut Newton Illustrated it's a little bit different, so we realized this for a former show. But here the long wall we see, some of these were also realized in the context of the Zeit magazine commission, but not published. And then some others were shot later in the 90s. So he was coming again to Berlin as the wall was fallen and realizing something which was used sometimes as a backdrop motive for collages he did and printed out for his big exhibition at the New National Gallery later on in the year 2000 on the occasion of his 80th birthday, and for a little bit earlier, 97, for Max magazine. And as he was with his scissors putting out some other pictures and gluing it at these kind of cityscapes, and creating something completely new, a new combination. It was a playful combination with these kind of motives. Again, you see the tank here, the Russian tank, close to the Avos area. Then we see some mess, within the city with these construction sites and so on. And the next one is about the Reichstag, the transfer of the Reichstag, and shot in 96. It was directly after Christo was doing his intervention, with the Reichstag in Berlin, which was also photographed by Helmut Newton, of course, as we will see in a minute. And so the opening of the wall, there's again here the big hole in the wall looking through to the other side, and with some graffitis, and then you see the structure within, looking at the city, showing us the city. Then we have the Olympic Stadium, the entrance, and many pictures here are just shot again for himself, and then just used later on as background motifs for his collages. The next one was published, the exterior of this building with the car in front. This is a famous brothel, in Berlin. He was putting this picture into the Traveler magazine, funnily, and other pictures have some remarks and notices on the back, like the radio tower getting up here, and then re-photographed by Newton during the night in the 90s. And as I said before, this was actually his first picture, shot in 1932. He came out of the tube and then ending up, and this is more or less the picture number 1 in his unreleased unrealized oeuvre catalog. Some other buildings, covered by stones and not being opened with of these windows. And it was a former Spanish embassy and just some birches trees. He was interested more and more in these kind of nature, of course, landscapes and cityscapes. And this is a series of pictures we have never shown before. We just found in the estate, in the boxes we got here. There was a folder with all these pictures, as photocopies with his comments on. So he was actually preparing something for one of his upcoming exhibitions, but not realized, and now realized by us. The last one here on the row is the Christo piece of the Reichstag, and the shooting by Helmut. These two big motifs actually belonging to the series of the landscapes and cityscapes. These prints were exhibited in Zurich and being part of the project Sex and Landscapes. And we opened our exhibition of work with this body of work together with Us and Them, another project Helmut Newton realized together with his wife June under the name of Alice Springs. On the opposite side, in between, all the magazines, the Newton Illustrated, the Traveler magazine, the Zeit magazine, Manor Vogue, Max magazine, and then the commentary on a review about and the retrospective he did on the occasion of his 80th birthday at the New National Gallery. For the first time ever, a photographer was invited to do this. And then the last one, the Süddeutsche magazine with a store dummy, and then on the opposite wall, you see the vintage print of this cover motif. So we have a lot of cover stories from the 70s to 2001. He realized for the magazines as commissions, and then you have a lot of side shots he realized coming back to Berlin. Between the windows, you see, one picture, a very unusual picture with the big nudes in the back. Helmut Newton behind, a newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And there was a huge campaign, actually realized by Alfred Seiland, an Austrian photographer, but Newton did it more or less himself in the same style of this famous campaign. This picture was used by Frankfurter Allgemeine instead of the picture of Alfred Seiland, and he has a camera on the table. So he presses a button. Of course, it's not a real self-portrait, but a directed self-portrait, because otherwise, if it would be realized with the help of a mirror or so on, then the Frankfurter Allgemeine would be inverted. But in this case, it looks like a self-portrait. But here again, it's one of the last pictures, he realized here in Berlin in the year 2000, as he had his big retrospective, as he was invited to the holy halls of the New National Gallery. And here on the other wall, and some more color pictures, we again, as I said before, the cover motif of the Süddeutsche Zeitung magazine. And within this magazine, there were published many pictures we saw before, from the 70s, from the 80s and 90s. So there was a kind of a mix. He was invited, get carte blanche, to realize a portfolio within these magazines. And then he took some new pictures, here in this case 2001, and including also some others already from the 70s. It was calling it My Berlin. And so going back to the roots, more or less, in his photography. And here, two more pictures, a kind of a diptych. It's not a diptych, but from the same spot, the Glienicke Bridge, which is called also the Spy Bridge, or the Bridge of Spies, you all know from the film of Steven Spielberg, here with the model Nadja Auermann, who lives on the other side in Potsdam. So it connects Potsdam and Berlin. And it's a famous spot, used by Helmut several times. And in this case, this fashion shooting for Marie Claire, was shot exactly on that place. And as we all know, Newton very often took the places, and he was there as a location scout, and he was doing notices in his tiny little notebooks, and writing down what he had in mind beforehand, before he went to the set, before he came back to Berlin. And writing everything down. So this was the year 95. So we are going back now in this last compartment, back to the 90s. But, everything has some connections in between because these pictures were realized for magazines or for himself. And these bigger size picture, this square picture, realized, of course, again by a 6x6 camera with the rudder flags he was using, and the others were taken sometimes also with small lens cameras with 35 millimeter films. This one here with a man and the naked women on the side. It refers, of course, to his idea of the naked and dressed picture series. But here we have a kind of a chauffeur with a Mercedes in the background, and then we have the half nude or the nude women, with the open coat. So you can read as you want this picture, and for me it's also something going back into the idea of Adam and Eve. So it's of course about seduction, but actually it was shot for men's fashion campaign. It's about the shoes of the man he was wearing. On the side, another nude or half nude or whatever you call it. Again, the idea of the guest house, of this old fashioned guest house in Berlin, shot in Berlin. And we have a blonde model on the side and then another one on the right side. If you look a little bit closer and a little bit longer on it, then you see that the right one is just a store dummy. So he was playing around with this again, not only in the 60s and 70s, he was using this idea again as he would quote himself. It's a picture realized in this guest house, and this was used as a poster motif for his exhibition in the new National Gallery. And then this was the cover motif. It's called Wurstmaxe. There was really this guy, close to the Kurfürstendamm, where Newton stayed normally, and within the hotel around the corner, be it the Kempinski or Savoy or whatever, with a client. She eats a sausage and have a can of beer, a Berliner beer in her hand. So on the back of this picture, on the back of this vintage print, you can read, and is also published within the book, the accompanying book, Berlin, Berlin, realized by Taschen. You can read here, this is the room service when Helmut's room service in the hotel closes. And then, the last war, the final war, realizing a series of nude and, in several other ideas, like a spy story or so. And two were shot in the Grand Hotel and the other in the Hotel Askanischer Hof, or it's a kind of a pension, a guest house, and in between situation. I mean, again, here, he liked this style of interiors, and then he placed the nude on the side, and this was realized finally also for the German men's Vogue. Here again, it's a kind of a mysterious situation, with a man here and somebody sitting in the back, and then they have the hotel lobby, these corridors, and unusual. It's mysterious. There's a strange atmosphere within it, and then you see the man here on the table, sitting on the table, and another one is on a chair. It's these kind of mysterious situations, you find very often in his photography. So in total, you have a lot of black and white photography, as we can see. Sometimes sunlight, more or less. It's gray sky. And we have all the genres, which we find or also in other parts of his work. It's nude photography, it's fashion photography, and portraits, of course, the three main genres, but also here a lot of landscapes. And you have in total these kind of very melancholic atmosphere here in Newton's picture, especially with the Grunewald Lake, and it's a little bit, melancholic, and he realized something at the end of his life, getting, in the year 2000. He died in 2004. So it has nothing to do with something which we can see and which we are encountered with, pictures from LA, from Paris, Côte d'Azur. The Berlin pictures are different. And we are very, very happy that we have them here for the first time in this combination on the wall of the Helmut Newton Foundation. On the one side of the exhibition rooms of the Helmut Newton Foundation, we saw about 100 pictures of Helmut Newton's Berlin. So it's a portrait of the city. For us, it's also an homage to Helmut and his hometown. And the whole thing is it's 20 years anniversary exhibition, which we called Berlin, Berlin. And we are entering now the second part of the exhibition, the group show, Berlin, Berlin. We start here with the work of Eva. Eva was the teacher of Helmut Newton in the years 1936 to 1938, and we lend here 15 vintage prints from Eva, shot mostly in Schlüterstraße 45, close to the Kurfürstendamm, which was her studio. Sometimes we see on pictures Helmut Newton followed, looking at the motive later in his work. So he transformed her style, her three genres, fashion, especially fashion, nude photography and portrait photography. He transformed that congeniusly into the contemporary photography later on, decades later. So he was confronted with these kind of photos in the 30s as he was working for her as an apprentice. And some motives are very, very close to pictures we know from his own work. Yeah, we worked with several collectors, galleries, and some photographers themselves, as I'm asking them, lending us place for your work for this group show. And of course, we start here, the group show, with Eva and her work. In the vitrine, we see some samples of Helmut Newton's library, books dedicated to the topic of Berlin. It starts with Zille, Salomon, Seidenstücker, Eva herself, Umbo, and then some photos from the Weimar Republic up to Leni Riefenstahl and Michael Schmidt. And Michael Schmidt we will see much later within this exhibition, this group show as well. So there are some works between the windows, 4 and 4 vintage prints, and another 7 of Eva on the wall opposite. All of them are for the first time here at the Helmut Newton Foundation. That it was always our dream to combine and to compare and to juxtapose Newton's work with the work of Eva. And this is here for the first time, and we are very, very happy about that. So we are still in the Weimar Republic, and it's let's say overlapping into these first years of the Nazi dictatorship. Helmut left in 1938, and Eva stayed, unfortunately, and she was killed in a concentration camp in 1942. So Eva went with her models also to Wannsee area and to the other lakes in the south of Berlin. And this was done by Helmut later on and parallel as well, as we see in the first room of the Newton pictures. This his self-portrait with 3 girlfriends, shot in Halensee, another lake in the south of Berlin. Just a few years later, the war ended with a complete destruction of the city of Berlin. And there was a photographer, as well as several other photographers, but a very famous photographer, Revolt, who came with the Russian troops to Berlin and documented the last battles around the area of the Reichstag. So these are famous pictures published in several books, also in historical books. Here, the flag on the Reichstag, and then it's a historical moment. Yevgeny Khaldei covered here with his camera for us to look back. And so we see the troops or some soldiers, having the flag, the Russian flag, the Soviet flag, in hands, and putting it up at the Reichstag or at the quadriga of the Brandenburg Gate. And one of the soldiers, actually a poet, holds the piece and left over from the war in his hand, smiling into the camera of Yevgeny Khaldei. And this piece is the head, of course, the cast head of Adolf Hitler. So this is for us also a great commentary, on this, on this end, on this special end of the war. Helmut was able to flee the Nazis and Ivar was not, unfortunately, but the Russian troops came into the city, of course, destroying the city, but of course, on the other hand, freeing the city and the rest of Germany from the dictatorship of the Nazis by then. Helmut Newton left the city through the train station at the zoo, through Trieste and Singapore to Melbourne. And in that year, in the year 45, he already opened a studio in Melbourne and living there for several years. And so he was not witness of the destruction of his beloved hometown, but others were, of course, and we have on one hand this great photo documentation of what's the leftover of the cities and this devastation. And there was not only Khaldei, but there was also a photographer called Hein Gorny, who was accompanied with somebody who had a plane. It was Adolf Sieb Myers from the West. And so he flew over Berlin and then he made an incredible documentation in the fall of 1945 of the destroyed city after World War II. And so these vintage prints, also on loan of a photo institution here in Berlin, these vintage prints, it's a very small ones. You have to go very close to if you're in front of these, and you witness the destruction on one hand, and you see some of the landmarks nearly untouched, including the Olympic Stadium. In the vitrine, you saw the book of Leni Riefenstahl that was about the Olympics. She not only did the film on the Olympics, commissioned by the International Olympic Committee, she also did a book on that. And Helmut Newton was a witness of these Olympic Games, as he was still living in Berlin in 1936. He was a sports enthusiast, and as he wrote in his autobiography, we can read this passage, on the Olympic Games as he was going into the Olympic Stadium. And later on, he was photographing the Olympic Stadium for the leftovers 60 years later in 95, 96, as he came back to Berlin. We see here several places, also the Brandenburg Gate, the Tiergarten area. The last picture here on this row, it's Berlin Mitte, so the district, which is, let's say, more or less the oldest one, the really center, the main center of Berlin, with a Schinkel museum called Altes Museum, the old museum, the dome, the Berlin Dome on the side, and the city castle. So this was shot in 45 or 46. We can't date these pictures perfectly, but so one of these two tours, Hein Gorny and Adolf Sieb Myers did, in these 2 years, they were shot during these flights over Berlin. Here on the main wall, you see more or less the same situation. So we're coming from Hein Gorny's destruction, but this was shot just 6 years later. Arvid Messmer, Fritz Tiedemann. Fritz Tiedemann was a photographer commissioned by the GDR authorities to document the war destruction and the status of the city of Berlin, but in the eastern part, of course, and the so-called Soviet sector. And what we see here is the Schinkel Museum, then we see the Berliner Dome, but what we don't see anymore is the city castle, because the GDR authorities blown this castle away as it was a symbol for Prussia, and so they wanted to erect a new building for the city of East Berlin, more or less. That became the capital of the GDR. So we see this gentleman crossing the street. Of course, there were no traffic lights by then. Some cars are just on the street. It's not an ordinary life already, 6 years after the end of the war, but we see there's radical changes. Later on, in the 70s, there will be at the vast place where the city castle was, there was the so-called Palace of the Republic built up by the GDR and the East Berlin authorities. And and this building was then, after the German reunification, again rebuilt to make some space for the Humboldt Forum, to host some museums pieces from the other museums of the state museums. So this is an incredible document. Arvid Messmer made a huge research in the archive of the Berlinische Galerie, and then he found the original negatives, and then he made a reconstruction of this situation Fritz Tiedemann took, and then he digitalized all the pictures, and then he created such a big 6-meter wide picture for an exhibition at the Berlinische Galerie later on. There's another work by Arvid Messmer. You see here on this huge table, these are 12 books with archival material. So Arvid Messmer is not only a photographer himself, he is also a great archivist. I mean, he finds something within the archives nobody else does. In this case, he goes into the state's archives, he finds pictures of unknown photographers doing a huge reportage of the whole wall built from 1961 onwards. And this is the state of the wall in the year 1966 and 67. So in total, it's 1,056 images. Also here, panoramic pictures, as a huge documentation by the East German troops looking from east to west, which is a very unusual way to look at Berlin. Normally it's vice versa. So we have some pictures, from West Berlin photographers looking east. But in this case, this is a unique documentation, and these 2 volumes are a piece of art in itself. And then there are some comments, heard by, from the East German troops, and, noticed are written down, and these were curated and commented by Annette Gröschner. So it's a combined project by Arvid Messmer and Annette Gröschner. And so what is unusual for that too is it was just made as a documentation for the East German engineers to create a better wall. The people were not able to escape anymore, from east to west. So the whole wall was 153 kilometers long. You can imagine, 1,056 images, it's a lot on one hand, but documenting 150 kilometer long wall, big task on one hand, but on the other hand, you have a unique documentation of it here. Opposite this huge panoramic of Arvid Messmer and Fritz Tiedemann, there's another group of work realized by actually an East Berlin photographer called Arno Fischer, who was a very influential figure, in photography, also later as a professor in Leipzig. And so he was close to the founding of the Ostkreuz agency. Well, he was not a member of the founding member, but he was very close to that. And then he opened another school for photography called Fotografie am Schiffbauer Damm, where this is the place where he lived with his later wife, Sibylle Bergemann. And he was visited by so many photographers because he became a great name, in photography, even if it was still the GDR. And also Helmut Newton and Alice Springs visited him in East Berlin one day in the 80s. So what we see here on this long wall is a part of his project called Situation Berlin, Situation Berlin, as he called it. It was about a book he wanted to do, and publishing, in East Berlin. Actually, he was studying architecture, in West and East. It was the years before the building up of the wall, the rise of the wall. All the people were able to go from east to west, from west to east, and so on. So he did. And so he photographed in the west and in the east of the city. So in the different sectors, of course. And what we see here is a mix of these eastern and western pictures from Berlin. Of course, this book was not able to be published after August 61 because the East German authorities are not allowed anymore to publish a book like this with Western pictures and Eastern pictures. And as you can see here, a mix. These are vintage silver prints. It's great that these pictures were lent by a private collector through a gallery here from Berlin, and that we are able to show this because it's such an important series on Berlin, showing both sides, East and West, and these are ordinary people on the street, as we can see, cars, a little bit architecture, still with some Nazi symbols, which we were able to find within the 50s. So, but the street scenes, it's about the really street photography, which was very, very popular in these years. You were able to find something very similar in France, shot by the humanistic photographers, like Willy Ronis or Doisneau and so on. Or you can find also in the US with photographers like Robert Frank, kind of a zeitgeist of that time, that's what Arno Fischer did. Of course, he was not aware of all the other photographers doing something similar as well in the other cities. Finally, the project was realized as a book and as an exhibition at the Berlinische Galerie 15 years ago, but Arno Fischer was by then still alive, and he was able to witness that this project was fulfilled. And this was, of course, satisfying, These first years, it was not allowed to publish this. And then later on, it became a kind of a historical element and this historical source as well for other photographers. Yeah, Fischer was a very influential figure, as it was in the eastern part and a little bit in the western part, of course, as it was in the same way Will McBride. We see some of his pictures here on this extra wall, 5 of them, also vintage prints. By then, Will McBride came as a soldier to Germany, and then just a little later, actually, to South Germany. A little later, he came to Berlin in the 50s, and then he photographed a lot of people on the streets, young people celebrating life again. So it was the time as the young generation, came back into power, let's say. Just celebrating their life and enjoying their life in the street. But then it happened that in August 61, the wall was erected. So Will McBride became witness of this too. Before that, he was, like Arno Fischer, able to go from east to west and vice versa. And he was shooting here and there. The rise of the Berlin Wall was a big problem for him. He left Berlin for Munich. Later on, he did very famous projects. He did a book, His Pregnant Wife, Barbara, and then he did a book called Zeig mal. He became, as well, like Arno Fischer and like other photographers we show here in that exhibition, a very influential personality and photographer. And the last one here in a row shows us a very dramatic scenery, as we all know from our history books. It's the confrontation of American and Russian Soviet tanks direct at the checkpoint Charlie. But this was a very dramatic and dangerous situation, and we were by then very close to World War III, actually. And just 2 years later, as you all know, John F. Kennedy came to the city of Berlin, and then he said this very famous sentences supporting Berlin and the Berliners. And with this very special situation, he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I'm a Berliner. And so this was a very famous and sentence, and it's world politics, you see here within the show. And of course, we all know from history, from our history books, what happened here in Berlin. For us Berliners, we count in different eras. We say after the war, before the rise of the Berlin Wall, during the Berlin Wall, separating East and West. Then we say before the fall of the wall and after the fall of the wall, and then reunification and so on. It was the year 89, as we all know, that the wall was taken down. We see here with this more or less film scenes from Wim Wenders Foundation. It's a film called Himmel über Berlin, or Wings of Desire in English. You see here the actors, two actors, Bruno Ganz and Otto Sander. This story of the film, the two angels coming down to the city. Of course, it's the city of Berlin. In this case, we see the wall here with all the graffitis. The film was shot in 85, 86, came into the cinemas in 87. And these were exactly the same years as Helmut Newton was in town, as we saw on the other side of the exhibition already, with all the graffitis on the wall. It's the Potsdamer Platz area, the last two pictures. And it's sometimes the suburbs or let's say the border of the West Berlin city. Bruno Ganz as an angel stays here at the church around the place where we are here located. It's an incredible poetic film, as we all know, and also the pictures are more or less the same. If we more or less jump back into the city into the time of the 60s, and we have two pictures here of just two, but two great ones of FC Gundlach. FC Gundlach was a famous German fashion photographer, and of course a portrait photographer. Like Helmut did in these years, or started in these years. He is more or less of the same generation as Helmut is. And we see here two Berlin pictures he took in front of the Brandenburg Gate. This was the year 61, and we see the Brandenburg Gate without the wall. So it was exactly the moment before the wall was erected, with two Volkswagen Beetles, crossing the Brandenburg Gate, which was able by then, and then a model, in front of the camera. And this is exactly the same idea Helmut Newton did for Constanze magazine. So just 2 years later, FC Gundlach did something very similar for another fashion magazine from Germany, but he used here a telelens, as we can see, as the mayor's house in the background. Everything is taken together, and probably the model is not staying just in front of the wall like in Helmut's picture, but it's fantastic to see how these two great photographers had something in common. And so for us, it's also for the first time that we juxtapose Newton's work and the work of FC Gundlach. On the other side, we see the radio tower, the Funkturm, the first picture of Helmut, the Avus with the Mercedes-Benz sign, these two great cars, and Mercedes-Benz and another one, and two models. This is a very similar picture to a picture we saw already, in Newton's work, but just as a picture within the picture, as the man shot in 1987, confronted with a nude figure, in this old guest house, as a holder magazine, a newspaper in hands, with exactly this situation, the Avus, which was the first city race track in the world. Again, something which we had, for the first time here in this very, very modern city in the 20s by that. There's photos from the 60s, but referring to the time of the 1920s. So staying in the 1960s, like in other cities in the world, there was a big revolt, students, demonstrations, and so on, and then covered by the journalist Günther Zint. He was a reporter working for different magazines, including Spiegel, Stern magazine, Concrete. We see here is a kind of a critical comment on the reaction of the police to the demonstrations, with these waters and, with the tanks in front of the buildings here at the Kurfürstendamm, which is around the corner of our museum. And then opposite on these two tables, we see documentation, again by Arvid Messmer, compiled by him, photos he found in the archive of the police, of the West Berlin police. We had before, compiled by Alfred Messmer, the pictures of the East Berlin border troops. And here we have 2 volumes. The title is just Berlin, 1966 to 1970. These years of the student revolt. And what we see here is the police documentation by anonymous photographers from the police. And the funny thing is that it's very similar to the pictures we see on the opposite side shot by Günter Zint. But of course, it has an incredible different aim, incredibly different approach, because there was the documentation of what happened, on the streets by, let's say, the German authorities, in this case, West Berlin authorities. And then on the other side, we see something, which was critically photographed and used in left-wing papers. Formally, it's very, very close to each other. So we see the different ways to look at pictures through this juxtaposition. It's very interesting and eye-opening to combine and compare the look into these books and the pictures on the wall. The demonstrations ended up more or less in the 1970s. And then we have two pictures here, two color pictures. The first color ones here in the show, again by Günter Zint. On the right hand, it's the Checkpoint Charlie. We saw so dramatically exposed by Will McBride beforehand. And now it's a kind of a calm situation as it would be just a regular situation in this kind of border town in this front city between the West and the East. And there was still the people climbing up the wall were killed by the border troops. And then on the other side, the Kurfürstendamm, which is, a place where everything happened, where Eva's studio was around the corner, where Helmut was taking a similar bus like this one, going from the American school in the 30s to his home in Harlensee. It's a common situation, and it's exactly the time Helmut Newton came back into his hometown. As we all know, here in the city, there are living so many great photographers, and for us, it's very important to show not only Helmut Newton, but also contextualizing him, with the work of other photographers. We enter now a room with pictures of Maria Seefs. She is a great photographer from East Berlin. Now, after reunification, we just call ourselves Berliners, not East and West Berliners anymore. It's a 35 silver prints, which was the diploma work she did in Leipzig at the university, but all the pictures shot in Berlin, of course. And she studied with Arno Fischer. So these 35 images in this kind of an installation, site-specific installation with a hanging made by her. So it's a subjective documentation of the life in East Berlin. Tour through East Berlin. It's a very subjective approach. Sometimes it's a picture just shot from the screen. We see the Pope here, the Polish Pope. Sometimes, and the cover of the book, the accompaniment, the shadow of the radio tower in East Berlin, looking down from that place. And then somebody, bareheaded man from behind. The airport in East Berlin, which became now, interestingly, in Schönefeld, in the new airport of the whole Berlin after reunification. You see some details, some birds in the sky, and some symbols on stones. Some friends, some acquaintances, official situations here with the cars, some politicians get into the car or out of the car, monuments in East Berlin. In total, it's a great series of a photographer living in Berlin, in East Berlin, at the end of the, let's say, divorce of the city, or through the wall. It was shot from between 85 and 87. She brought all these pictures to Arno Fischer, to the Hochschule für Grafik und Buchkunst, which is a very famous university for photography in Leipzig. And she got her diploma with this series. And later on, many years later on, she published also a book with the title Inter. It's actually a Latin word. You can translate it probably with in between. It's a fantastic series, and we are very happy to have this here within the Berlin show on the wall. And it's for the first time that we can see it together with another great series of the West Berlin photographer. He did something very similar in West Berlin, and his name is Michael Schmidt. We see here in the next room we enter at the moment, it's on the right hand, these black and white photos, also with an installation, made by him. I mean, he's not there anymore. He died several years ago, but we have proofs, that he accepted these kind of hangings, and then these are the original frames. This is a series called Waffenruhe, which is to be translated with war, disease, more or less. So this was a very influential work he did in the year 85 till 87. The same years as Maria Seefs did her work, but nobody knew about the other. These two very famous series, speaking about the city, speaking about the gray skies and visualizing and transferring the city into this strong and full of contrast black and white photography. It became, very influential for so many following photographers. Diptychs and triptychs. We see the wall, we see a little bit landscape, we see through a window. It's a very interesting narrative because nothing happened actually. Bit similar to Maria Seefs' work. There's no action, so you can see or feel observations of life. And here's observation about a city. The whole thing, the whole exhibition is like a portrait of a city through the eyes of so many photographers. Of course, Helmut Newton on one side, and here we see 17 photographers in total. In the center of that room, this showcase filled up with two leporellos by the East Berlin photographer and actually urban planner Ulrich Wüst. He's became also very famous with his publications. He decided to present his pictures for that idea. So we have these incredible different ideas and forms of presentation within this exhibition, a black and white portfolio or 18 pictures in total. We see just here in a selection, black and white photography from the eastern part, from the district Mitte, where he lives. And so it refers a little bit to his own photography, which he started already in the 70s and especially in the 80s. But these pictures are from the 90s. So after reunification, showing us also the transformation of the city, some new skyscrapers, the destruction of official buildings. And on the other side, it's color photography as a leporello from West Berlin. It's just shop windows. So he's like the others before the rise of the wall. He was going from east to west, from west to east, just making his observations of the city. Still a little bit divided into two parts, paired in this vitrine. On the other side of the room, you see a great photographer called Thomas Floschitz. What we see here with this huge triptych is the new museum. Museum which was destroyed during the war on the museum's island, Columns. It's more or less a historical idea of Berlin, this historic time. You see still the bullet holes in the walls. So the people were fighting there, the German troops, the Russian troops, and fighting against each other. But these pictures are shot during the restoration of the building, the final step of the restorations, realized by the British architect David Chipperfield. You see here on the status of 2010. So we have a very long shadow of the Berlin War, which some traces on the main room of our exhibition. You saw already the war itself, the fighting troops. The traces of the war are not filled up and not covered. He's not an architectural photographer. Thomas Florschütz is also somebody who shows us a kind of a zeitgeist. It's more or less symbolic pictures. Also, the last one here, the color one as well, where he comes from. He was inspired, let's say, by Michael Schmidt and of course also by other photographers, because you see a very similar situation. You're looking through the glass. In this case, we see the Friedrich-Werdersche Kirche. It's a Friedrich-Werdersche church made by Schinkel. So we have through that very subtly also the Prussian Berlin included into our exhibition. Of course, there is a very important part, and if you buy a book about Berlin, the historical part, the Schinkel Berlin of the Prussian Berlin, it's a very strong one, even through that picture. And we have to show it somehow. I have to visualize it somehow, just some remains, kind of an atmosphere, what he was shooting here. And he stays in the Palace of the Republic in the former city castle's place, which was replacing the city castle. Time layers we can see here, because this building was destroyed directly after Florschütz and somebody else we will see in a minute were taking these pictures. On the other side, again, because we dedicated this room to two free photographers, Michael Schmidt, Thomas Florschütz, and Ulrich Wüst in the center, we see a polytyp. We have a triptych here on the side, and this is a polyptych picture, with 9 images combined from this project, Waffenruhe. And so we see 2 people here included. One is having just a beer in a bar, and another is a little bit of punk attitude. But normally, this series of Michael Schmidt, it's about the street scenes, but in his way. Very dark, black and white photography, full of contrast. Let's say at the end of division of the 2 parts of the city. And then we have in the center of this triptych, Sie verlassen den amerikanischen Sektor, the sign, you're leaving the American sector, with a wall in the back, combined with a table, with something on the side. The Berlin Wall is one of the main motives, of course, here in the exhibition, because it was covered by so many photographers, nearly by every photographer coming to the city or living here. So the last room of this exhibition, Berlin, is dedicated to Barbara Klemm. She is probably the best German photojournalist working for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung nearly exclusively, and she had so many exhibitions of her work, a group of silver gelatine prints, lent by her directly. Her archives are still with the Frankfurter Allgemeine in Frankfurt. It might be 1 million negatives she shot, during her career. On the left side, East Berlin pictures with Honecker and Brezhnev. Opposite, the situation directly around the fall of the wall. On the left side, we see this very famous socialist brother kiss between Honecker and Brezhnev, which became the motive transformed into a huge wall drawing on some parts of the wall here in Berlin, and then photographed by so many Berlin tourists. Here opposite left, it's the Brandenburg Gate again, then we have the death strip, 87, and it's the same moment, more or less, as Helmut Newton took this picture from a very similar place, with the Brandenburg Gate as a background motive. His fashion-based travel picture. Some politicians, some regular people. It's Willy Brandt, the former mayor of Berlin, then later on the chancellor of Germany, then more or less retired. But he became one of the key figures, in the reunification time. And this was the night of the 8th and 9th November, 9th to 10th November of 1989, the opening of the wall. Everybody speaks about the fall of the wall already by then. This is actually not true. There were just 1 or 2 border control station just opened. He appears, he got applauded, by the people staying around. And here we have Willy Brandt again and a bunch of people, Then we have Brandenburg Gate with some banners. Egon Krenz, who was a former East German politician and holding also a speech, because it was kind of a dramatic situation, in the night of the 9th to the 10th of November. Nobody knew what's going on, how it's going on. But then there was a pure mass of people, going through the wall to the opened gates. coming to Berlin. It was a reunification also on the streets, the reunification of West Berliners and East Berliners. Yeah, and then we have some more pictures, from the event of the 3rd of October, which is a reunification day in Germany. Some other politicians before or after the demonstrations, or the celebrations, with the opened wall, again the Brandenburg Gate on the back and the Reichstag and so on. These iconic motifs, they're very often appearing also in Barbara Klemm's pictures. As we all know, Helmut Newton was reading the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Even if he lives in Monaco, LA, he was 100% familiar with her work. And as we all know, and as we saw already in the first pictures as we started our tour, Helmut Newton with a hat and the coat was about to leave the studio to go out to the world of becoming a reporter. This was one of his first wishes because before he went into fashion photography area. But this was his first idea. Therefore, we put Barbara Klemm on the back of this parcours. As we saw with the work of Thomas Florschütz, we see here at the last picture a shot of Half Zimmermann, and more or less they were photographing shoulder on shoulder, staying within the Palace of the Republic, looking out to the city on the Alexanderplatz area with the other radio tower. And this is more or less the same angle which we saw already in this huge panoramic picture. Everything changes in Berlin. So this picture as a symbol ends our tour here and also the exhibition Berlin. And I'm very happy that we were able, with the help of so many great collectors, to realize such an exhibition, which is our 20 years anniversary exhibition at the Helmut Newton Foundation.